Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to part 2 of the ZOWIE G-SR II review. So today we're going to be doing a much more deep dive on the G-SR II itself, talking about how it fared during testing, some of the unique aspects of the pad as well, and following up on a couple things I mentioned during my initial unboxing video. Now, not to spoil too much, but the G-SR II actually really surprised me. This pad performed very uniquely as compared to a lot of other things I've tried this year, so I'm really excited to go and tell you guys all about it. Thank you again to ZOWIE for sending this out for review. I greatly appreciate it, and as always, I will have timestamps down in the video description and in the comments down below, and this video will be fully subtitled, so if I'm talking too fast for you guys and you can't understand my Canadian XQC talk, you can enable those to help you guys out. But let's go ahead and get right into the full review of the ZOWIE G-SR II. Alrighty, let's start off with build quality. Now, one of the things ZOWIE really wanted to improve on coming from the G-SR I to the G-SR II was the overall quality and consistency of the performance on the pad, and I will say they have done a really fantastic job in terms of build quality and QC. This pad is essentially perfect in my eyes. There isn't a single loose thread of this entire pad. The surfacing is completely even. There's no oddities in the stitching. Just everything about this pad is incredibly well designed. So props to ZOWIE here. This is probably like the best made pad I've seen this year, which is really impressive. Now keep in mind my thoughts on this are based off of only about 3-4 weeks of usage. So this may change down the line. If it does, I'll be sure to make a follow-up video. But given how the build quality of this pad seems to be incredibly good, I'm assuming it's going to stay fairly consistent going forward. But again, if there's any issues that come up, I will make a follow-up video. Alright, next up let's talk about the surface of the G-SR II, because there's some very unique properties about the surface of the G-SR II that does make this pad stand out as opposed to the rest of the pads on the market in a very unique way. So the surface of the G-SR II is actually surprisingly soft. To the hand, it actually feels quite soft, but the more you push into it, the rougher it gets. The actual surface layer of the pad is very malleable, like you can push into it quite deeply. Once you push into it to a certain amount, you hit like a medium firmness pad in the middle. It's a very unique feel to it overall. Now, this uniqueness does have some very interesting effects in terms of performance. Basically what happens is that the more you push your mouse into the mouse pad, the more your control you're going to get. Now that will vary on your mouse gate design, that kind of stuff, but it does give a variability to the control factor you're going to feel on the G-SR II, which is really unique. Now, breaking out my digital microscope, you can see that the surfacing on the G-SR II is this very tight zigzag patterning. Now, I did do a full pad inspection on the surfacing, and I didn't notice any kind of inconsistencies with the surface stitching on the G-SR II. However, one thing I noted during my unboxing was, hey, there's like this weird oddity in the X-axis performance as opposed to the Y-axis performance. They don't feel the same. And turns out that there is actually going to be a very, very, very minimal difference in the Y-axis resistance as opposed to the X-axis. And a big reason for that is the gaps in the texturing here. So because the stitching on the G-SR II is this linear zigzag, there are these little gaps that can appear between them that aren't consistent between every single linear stitch. And because of this, this is going to cause a very, very, very minor difference in the Y performance. Now, 99.9% of people are not going to notice this because traditional mel skates have a bigger surface top skate and a bigger surface bottom skate, so you are very accustomed to higher friction on the Y-axis. However, for me as a dot skate user, I notice this almost immediately because I'm a lot more sensitive to differencing in the X and Y resistance. So there will be a very, very, very tiny difference in the Y-axis performance as opposed to the X-axis, which is worth noting. Again, 99.9% of people are not going to notice this, but it is something I wanted to mention regardless. Alright, now one other thing I wanted to note about the G-SR II surfacing is some compatibility with specific mouse skates. Now, if you are someone who's using very thin skates like 0.45 or 0.6 millimeter skates, you may have issues where, depending on your grip style and how far you push your mouse into the surface of the G-SR II, because the G-SR II does have a very soft surface that you can push into very easily, you may run into situations where your mouse skates aren't going to be tall enough to compensate for that depth, and the base of your mouse is actually going to rub up against the mousepad surface itself. Now, this didn't happen on that many mice in my situations, and all the mice that it happened on were very, very, very thin skates. So keep that in mind. If you have really thin skates, you may have issues with that. Again, it will depend on the surface area of the skates and the materials and that kind of stuff. There's a lot of variables to this, but it is something worth noting. So if you're using dot skates or just super thin skates, you may want to switch off to something a little taller. Generally speaking, I'd recommend for going something around the 0.8 to 1 millimeter thickness as the best way to kind of compensate for this. But again, it will depend on your grip style and that kind of stuff, but it is something I wanted to know as well. Similar to the XY performance, it's not really something that a lot of people are going to notice, but for those of you who are in a unique situation, it may be a little detrimental to your usage on the G-SR II. All right, now I wanted to explore a little more about this control variability that I've been talking about on the GSR2 because there's a lot of factors that are going to affect your usage on the GSR2. And in my case, I actually found the GSR2 felt surprisingly fast. I actually felt like it performed more like a hybrid pad for my use case. But because of the variability of the surfacing on the GSR2, there's going to be a lot of factors that are going to change how this pad is going to feel for you. So I wanted to break this down into 3 categories and kind of talk about how different grip styles are going to affect the usability of the GSR2. Now keep in mind, this is a generalization. There are other factors that are going to affect this, such as the weight of your hand, the positioning of your arm, whether it's resting on the pad or floating. Your skate type is going to change this, the weight of the mouse. All these things are going to affect that. But in my opinion, from what I found during testing, the actual grip style and weight of the hand pushing on the mouse into the pad is going to be the most important factor. Now, for all these examples, I used my Pulsar X2H, which is weighing in at 55 grams with the included stock skates. Alright, so let's start off with fingertip grip. Now, since fingertip grips is going to add very little weight to the mouse, in my case it only added around 25 to 30 grams, the mouse actually feels extremely fast on the surface, more in tune to like a hybrid pad like the Focus Ambition. Now, the reason for this is that because you're not putting as much weight on the mouse, it's not going to be pushing into the surface of the GSR2 nearly as much, meaning that there's not going to be as much force contact between the skates and the rougher parts of the pad itself. So if you fingertip grip on the GSR2, it's going to feel surprisingly fast. It does still have really good stopping power, but it's going to feel a lot faster than a focused control pad like ZOWIE's marketing it to be. Whereas palm grip, which adds significantly more weight to the mouse, it added around 300 grams to my X2H, makes the GSR2 feel like a complete mud pad, very much like what the GSR1 felt like. Now again, this is due to all this extra weight pushing the skates into the pad, hitting that middle foam layer and having the resistance of the middle foam layer pushing up and the skates pushing down, meaning there's going to be a bunch of surface friction between the skates and the actual surface stitching of the GSR2. So this is going to make this pad feel much more controlled, but again, that will depend on the weight of your hand for the most part. Now, when it comes to claw grip, which is my natural grip style, this only added around 120-ish grams to my X2H, and this is why the GSR2 felt so fast for me, because there's not going to be as much friction from the skates pushing into the pad as there would be on palm grip, but there's more than there is on fingertip grip. So this is why the GSR2 felt more like a hybrid pad to me, because it just felt like a lot more balanced overall. Again, there's still really good stopping power from the actual surface stitching itself, but just overall, this felt like the most balanced grip style. Now again, keep in mind that this is going to vary depending on hand size and that kind of stuff, but for generalization, you're going to feel the fastest on fingertip, you're going to feel the slowest on palm, and claw grip is going to feel the most balanced. Now, one cool thing, as I kind of alluded to before, due to the surfacing of the GSR2 being so soft, if you need more control with fingertip grip and palm grip, you can force the mouse into the pad a little more. Now, I'm not someone who really does this. I try to keep my grip as level as possible, but if you want to do that, if you're playing a tracking game and you're trying to track someone at a distance and you're moving too fast, you can push down on the pad to get more control. Again, no real point doing that on palm grip because there's already so much weight pushing into the pad, but for fingertip grip and claw grip, you can add even more variability to the control coefficient you're going to feel on your mouse, as opposed to what you're already going to feel from the weight of your hand pushing your mouse into the surface. Now, while we're talking about how different grip styles can affect your performance on the GSR2, one thing we have to talk about is how moisture affects your experience on the GSR2. Now, the GSR1 did have a lot of issues in terms of moisture, where high humidity environments would cause the pad to slow down in random areas and would cause inconsistencies with the surface performance. And this is one area where ZOWIE wanted to address and fix this issue going on to the GSR2. Now, for my testing here, I went a little overkill here. I didn't try to replicate a high humidity environment. I just soaked the mouse pad and to see what would happen with it. So I've exposed the pad to way more water than you would ever experience even in a high humidity environment, but just for sake of testing, I figured I might as well soak it. And I'm actually kind of blown away with how much water this thing could absorb. ZOWIE could honestly rebrand this thing as like a scrub daddy towel with how much water this thing can hold. I'm actually kind of shocked. Because there's this middle layer on the GSR2 and there's a very thin surface layer, any moisture or water that's applied to the surface layer gets kind of sucked through the surface layer into this middle layer, where it gets held in kind of like a ballast tank, if that makes sense, and then it'll just evaporate over time. Now, what this does is, because all the moisture gets sucked into this middle layer, the top layer remains largely unaffected despite how much water you put onto it, which is really impressive. So what I did for testing is I just did a bunch of runs on Kovac's intro scenario with wetting the pad in between every single use on different skates, and I honestly have to say it didn't really make a difference at all. The moisture had pretty much no effect on the pad at all, which is crazy impressive. I guess the proper word is resistant, but I guess the better word is absorptive, because it absorbs the water into the second layer. It's not like it resists moisture, if that makes sense. But I'm very impressed in how good it is against that. Now, this also kind of opened my eyes because I did a bunch of water testing on my other mouse pads, and the GSR II just like sucks water up like no tomorrow, whereas a lot of the other pads and similar pads to the GSR II just did not absorb water, or it took forever for it to happen, where the GSR II was almost instant. So I'm really impressed with how well they did in terms of moisture absorption here. That's really impressive. Alrighty, let's talk about the in-game performance. Now, just as I mentioned, keep in mind your performance is going to be a little different depending on your grip style, your skates, the weight of the mouse, and that kind of stuff. For me, I'm personally a claw gripper, so I had the more balanced feeling on the GSR II, which did make the GSR II feel more like a hybrid pad, which in all honesty is actually a really good thing, because I love hybrid pads, and having a hybrid pad with a little more stopping power than you traditionally find is just great in my opinion. But regardless, I did test this with a bunch of different mice with a bunch of different skates just to make sure I did have a full experience on this mouse pad. So I tested it with my Death Adder V3 with the Corepad stock clones. I tested it with my Pulsar X2H with the stock skates. I tested it with my Keychron M3 Mini and M3 Mini 4K with the XRAPad Jade and Obsidian skates on those as well. Now, in terms of tracking performance, the GSR II actually performed significantly better than I expected it to do so. Honestly, like to a new level in my opinion that I haven't really experienced on any other mouse pad I've tried this year, because the ability to push your mouse into the mouse pad to get a little more control gives us an incredibly good feeling for tracking performance and target switching performance, because the actual surfacing of the pad, since it's a linear zigzag switch, does give a lot of consistencies for the X and Y movements. Obviously there'll be a little bit of a variability on the Y axis depending on your skates and that kind of stuff, but for the most part it's going to be 1 for 1. But the ability to track someone and then kind of push the mouse into the pad a little more to stay on them when you're going to shoot was really nice. On top of that, the natural kind of softness of the pad does increase the actual stopping power of the pad significantly, so it's really good for doing like target switching flicks as well. And honestly, it blew my mind how well it performed. Playing Overwatch, Tribes 3, and the finals, I was just beaming people and target switching people like it was so easy. So the pad, exceptional performance in terms of tracking and target switching, way better than I expected. Now, where the GSR II really shines though is in the flicking and static performance. And my God, this pad is in a league of its own of how good it feels. The best way I can describe how this pad feels is that, you know, like when you're playing and you have an old mouse and nothing feels right. It just like you always feel like something's slightly off with your aim, and you get a new mouse and you hop in the game and you start absolutely frying people. And it's like that last piece of the puzzle sliding into the completed puzzle, like that kind of a feeling where everything just clicks. That is what the GSR II feels like when you're using it for Valorant, that kind of stuff. Just the ability to glide across the pad with very minimal effort, the great stopping power provided by the pad, in combination with, of course, the tracking performance, making it very easy to target switch and flick between people. The amount of ludicrous shots I was consistently getting on Valorant is honestly like insane. And Valorant is a game I really do struggle with to be consistent, because I don't really play it that much because I don't really have a lot of time, and Valorant is a game you have to play it a lot to be very consistent with. But I was able to hop in every couple days and just hit some ludicrously good shots in Valorant. And it wasn't just Valorant, even flicking performance in games like Overwatch, Tribes, the finals, even like in Kovac's performance, just everything took a huge jump, and this pad just felt so good. It's hard to describe how good it felt, and this was across all the mice I tested with all the different mouse skates, dot skates, stock skates, as everything felt extremely consistent. It was incredible. So honestly, the GSR II is in a league of its own in performance. It is unlike anything I have used this year, and it is easily the best pad I've used this year in terms of in-game performance. I'm blown away by how good this pad performed. It's actually kind of insane. All right, let's talk about the rubber base on the GSR II. Now, during my unboxing video, I said, wow, the GSR II's base feels really similar to the VAXI PA's base. And because they're both rubber bases, they do feel very similar. And actually, if you look at them both under a microscope, they're almost identical. So that's actually a really good thing in my opinion. Yes, it would have been nice to see maybe a stickier base on the GSR II, but given how a lot of Poron mousepads that have come out this year have had some very mixed results in terms of their adhesion quality, I actually prefer just to see a high quality pad with a rubber base. Now, rubber bases do have a downside where they don't really make that much contact unless there's pressure being put on top of them. So if you don't have your arm or anything sitting on top of the pad, you can just push the pad around with your finger, no problem. However, the moment you put something something onto the pad to anchor it down, it works completely fine. Now, one thing I did notice, though, while the base does make good adhesion and good grip when their arm is on top of it, if you're using a higher friction arm sleeve, I do notice that sometimes the pad can shift a little bit depending on your movement. Specifically me, because I rest my entire arm on the pad. Sometimes I did notice the pad shifted just a little bit. It never shifted like a crazy amount that would affect my performance, but it was just enough for me to notice it. So that is one thing to note, but the actual overall performance of the base has been completely fine. Again, just as long as you put something on top of it, like your arm or your hand, you're probably fine. It won't be that big of an issue, but it does perform in spec for a rubber base, so I'm happy to see it. And again, I'd rather have a rubber base that is a little weird rather than have a pour-on base that just doesn't stick. So I'm happy to see that here on the GSR II. All right, now let's talk about the GSR II's stitched edge. Now, the stitched edge here is very nice. It is very similar to the one found in the Focus Ambition and the HyperX Pulsefire Haste in terms of quality. Very good. There's no loose threading on it. It just feels very solid overall. It is fairly smooth, so you can rub your arm over it, no problem. It won't adhere onto skin and kind of cause extra drag, which is nice to see. It also works really good with arm sleeves, so no problems there. Now, I will say there is an ever so slight difference between the surface of the pad and the actual edging, like maybe like 0.1 millimeter or 2 millimeter. It's very, 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 very minute, but something I did want to note regardless. But the actual stitched edge is really good. And again, with the GSR II essentially just being a VAX EPA with a stitched edge, I'm very happy to see it here because it does feel very good. And having a non-90 degree edge is just better overall for a pad of this kind. So very happy to see that. Very happy with the implementation on the GSR II. Alrighty, now I also wanted to talk about the usage with arm sleeves because this being a high friction pad, arm sleeves can be a little bit mixed in terms of performance. But thankfully, due to the stitched edge on the GSR II and the overall smoothness of the surface, all the arm sleeves I tested worked completely fine. There was higher friction on some of them, and again, depending if you are using a very high friction pad, you can sometimes cause the pad to shift on the desk a little bit, but nothing that's going to impact performance. But my Pulsar ES sleeve, my just standard athletic sleeve, Skypad sleeve, and the Focus Pro sleeve all worked completely fine. I had no problems. The standard athletic sleeve did have the most friction just due to it being an athletic sleeve, not an actual gaming sleeve, but they all worked completely fine. I had no problems. Again, you can use this pad bare arm. I just prefer arm sleeves, but whatever you want to use will work completely fine. All right, now one thing that the GSR II unfortunately does suffer from, that all control pads of this variety do suffer from, is the affinity for cat hair and dust. Now, cat hair is just going to stick to this pad like a magnet, which is rather annoying. I have 3 cats, so whenever I want to use this pad, I do have to do an inspection on the pad to pull off all the cat hair on it, unfortunately. So if you do have pets, note that. Now, in terms of dust and crumbs aren't that big of an issue, but dust is a bit of a possibility of a concern for me because the surface layer, it just kind of lets everything sift through it. So if this pad does get really dusty, it's going to sift through to the middle layer. Now, I don't know if that's going to cause the pad to slow down over time and how hard it's going to be to clean it. So I'll have to make a follow-up video on that after a couple months of using this pad to see if it does develop any slow spots because of dust buildup and that kind of stuff. I'll have to see how it goes. But as of right now, cat hair is going to be the biggest problem. There may be other problems down the line, but I'll make a follow-up video about that if any of them do pop up in the future. All right, now before I go into my final thoughts, I did want to follow up on 2 things I noted during my unboxing of the GSR II. The first of which is going to be that chemically-like smell that came from my GSR II. Now, it did dissipate over time. It took about a week and a half for it to finally go away, but it never went away completely. For whatever reason, whenever there's high friction applied to the surface of the pad, like if you're using an arm sleeve and that kind of stuff, it does kick up a little bit of the smell. So there's still some of it in the pad. It still hasn't fully dissipated. I'm assuming after like another couple of weeks, it's going to go away completely, but that is something I wanted to note. I did speak to a fellow reviewer, Logpile, who said he also got a GSR II for review and he didn't have any problems with smell in his unit. So I'm either just got a brand new unit that wasn't sitting in stock for a long time. Your unit may not smell like this. If it does, it may take a little while for it to go away. Again, it's not the end of the world. It just does get a little overwhelming in terms of smell. And then the other thing I wanted to follow up on was the packaging. Now, as I mentioned in my unboxing video, the corners of this pad does roll up quite a bit and you do have to kind of reverse roll it to have it stop happening. Unfortunately, the pad still has not completely sat flat on my desk. It still does curve up at the corners, which is rather annoying. Now, I'm not like taking the pad off and rolling it up and throwing it in my closet or anything. I'm keeping the pad on my desk all the time and it still wants to keep rolling up. I'm not sure if maybe the edge stitching is just maybe stitched too tight and it's causing the pad to kind of bunch up. I'm not really sure what's causing it, but this would be an area, as I mentioned in my unboxing video, where flat packing the pad would be vastly superior to rolling it, because again, I've been using the pad for about 3-4 weeks and it's still picking up in the corner, which is kind of crazy. It would definitely be nice to see ZOWIE go for a flat pack design in the future to mitigate this issue, but that's one minor problem I did have with the mousepad. Now keep in mind, I'm not going to deduct points from this mousepad for this issue, because this happens on every single rolled rubber mousepad, so I'm not going to knock points for it. It would just be something I would like to see ZOWIE improve on in the future. All right, well, in terms of final thoughts on the G-SR II, I'm honestly really surprised. ZOWIE mousepads definitely do have a bit of a reputation as being mud pads. Off of the previous reviews I've watched about the GSR Red and the GSR Blue, I just always thought their mousepads were very slow. And while this mousepad can be very slow if you palm grip it or you push super hard into the pad, this pad does have a lot more of a hybrid nature to me. Despite it still being a control pad, it definitely feels very unique, and it just is in a league of its own in terms of performance, and that makes sense. The only real criticisms I have on this mousepad is the packaging and the slight differencing in the surface texturing. Both of those are just kind of like splitting hairs, because not that many people are going to notice the slight difference in the y-axis performance as opposed to the x-axis, and the packaging is just an issue that all rolled rubber pads have. I'm very much splitting hairs here, but overall the pad just performed so exceptionally well. It honestly just blew every expectation I had of a ZOWIE pad just out of the water. This thing just performed so well. So I'm incredibly impressed with this pad. I'm actually going to say that this is the best fabric pad I've used this year. The game performance and the consistency of this pad is just so good. I literally can't find anything else in my collection that comes even close to this thing. And just the uniqueness of the surfacing, the uniqueness of the performance, the ability to kind of alter the performance and customize the control to your preferential style is just so cool and so unique. This pad just is an S tier pad in my opinion. If you'd like to learn more about the GSR II, I will have the product pages down below if you're interested in checking one out for yourself. Again, global availability can be a little hard to find in some areas, but it's honestly worth paying the import fees to get it into the country. If I was to purchase this from the United States, it would be around $15 import fees, which would bring the pad up to around the $65 mark, which in all honesty is well worth it for a pad of this quality. So anyways, that is everything for the review of the ZOWIE GSR II. Huge thank you again to ZOWIE for sending us out for review. I greatly appreciate it. This pad has been a blast, and this is going to be a mainstay on my desk for a very, very long time. So thank you again for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, maybe consider leaving a like on the video and subbing to the channel so you don't miss any reviews in the future, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Peace.